Recording. Okay. And Taya, when you're ready, if you want to put your camera on, that would be great. So no rush. Um, if you've finished your sandwich. Well, welcome everyone to another Ask the Professional session. We're from OZeWAI, OZeWAI.org. We're a not-for-profit in Australia for accessibility specialists. I'm just going to share initially an acknowledgement of country. I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional custodians on the land on which I'm meeting today, and a few of us here in Canberra. And I pay respect to the elders of the Ngunnawal Nation, both past and present. And I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander peoples in attendance today. And I will ask you, please feel free to put in the chat your name, your role, and maybe who you pay your respects to, whether it's here in Australia or global as well, if there's some Indigenous cultures that you pay respect to as well. So yeah, just a little bit about OZeWAI. We are, as I said, for a not-for-profit in Australia for accessibility professionals. We used to run an annual conference. We now partner with conferences instead, and bring the accessibility expertise from our membership to those conferences and to participants there. And we've been running these now for a year, these sessions, and they're growing. They're very, very popular. I'm getting more topics in the survey as we go. So don't forget to do the survey. That would have been in your Humanitics link. And also there's a follow-up survey at the end. We'd like a bit of feedback. But to get us started, I'm actually going to go to my panelists here, and because our topic today is around design, accessibility and design. And we tend to just go around and ask each panelist to introduce themselves and give us a little bit of background of their role and why accessibility is important to them. So I'll start with you, Claire, if that's okay. If you could just do a little bit of a intro for yourself, and then we'll get into some of the questions.
No worries, thanks, Bree. My name is Claire Weber. I'm a digital accessibility consultant at Intopia. I'm here in South Australia, Adelaide. I work across broadly accessibility, working as an accessibility consultant, but I more specialize in the design accessibility space. Very fortunate to get to do that. I also run and facilitate training for designers. So I spend a lot of my working day working with design teams closely, training, coaching, and getting to do a bit of design work myself.
Excellent. And now I might go to you, Thea, if you could like to do a quick intro for us, please.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, as Bree said, I'm Thea. I'm working as a junior product designer right now. So I just graduated uni last year, so I'm fresh into my first full-time role, which is very cool. But yeah, so I guess my history with accessibility is that my mum is actually visually impaired. So it's always been something that's been on my radar, but obviously I haven't put it into practice until a bit later on, as I've actually started doing design work and working. And I'm currently working at a company called Offload, which is a logistics company.
That's great. Thanks, Taya. And you have, even in some of your volunteer work while you're at uni, started to pick up the accessibility and run with it. And it's been great to see. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that today. And Chris, you're calling to us from the US. Is that correct?
Yeah,
please,
I'm in
if you'd like
San
to do an
Diego.
intro. Yep.
Yeah, so I'm in San Diego. I work at Oracle, and my sort of career path on getting into accessibility, I was a front-end designer and developer working for University of Michigan. And that's when I started getting requirements that said, build this website and make sure it's accessible. And I had no idea how to do that. And once I started learning a little bit, the rest of the developers on the team said, great, you're the accessibility guy. So that's sort of how I stumbled into accessibility, started meeting real users with disabilities, users of assistive technology, and said, hey, that's really cool. So was able to sort of build those skills and do accessibility consulting, helping designers build accessible thinking into design drafts and ideas. From that experience coding, I also help debug and test and fix things like complex ARIA components, and do a lot of training, like Claire said, and hands-on coaching, trying to get people to do as much on their own, and not be a bottleneck, trying to basically make up for, I think, what I consider we have a gap in accessibility knowledge, where most design and developer programs might mention it, but I'm sure you've all seen this. People then get into corporate and organizational jobs, and they don't have quite the skills they need. Hence, we have our industry to help people.
Yeah, exactly right. And you've touched on something there that, I think a lot of us have learned or learned about accessibility a little bit further on in our careers, or at different times in our education, and it's not necessarily there earlier. But just on that, Chris, just to go back, why is accessibility important to you, do you think?
Well, again, connecting and building work relationships and friendships with folks with disabilities over the years, really see the difference in when it works versus when it doesn't. And we have so many cool technological things we take for granted. I think a perfect example of this is like ride sharing apps. And that's pretty recent. If that works for somebody with a disability where they can't drive, that gives people a whole new area of freedom and independence. But then if we don't do the accessibility, then people are locked out of that experience. So that's what excites me about accessibility, is seeing people to be able to use all these tools in a fair way for everybody that really helps people's independence and ability to, take control of their lives and do things independently.
No, exactly right. And there's an aspect, I probably say this in every session that I moderate about, tech is an enabler. We shouldn't be putting more barriers in by making it inaccessible to people, because it's actually one of those things that can give people independence and autonomy to do things themselves. And Claire, Thea, you mentioned that, you've had some family, and Claire, you're obviously in the industry for a bit, but can either of you maybe go a little bit deeper? Claire first, why is accessibility important to you?
I guess two of the areas that are big passion points in my life is technology and inclusion and equity. And that's like the perfect crossover between that, is making sure people have equal access to information. Like you said, the way technology is advancing really can help open up opportunities for people. Even just recently, I guess working at Intopia, we've always been remote, but I guess with the pandemic opening up more opportunities for people and organizations to get into remote working and have more processes around it, opens up a lot of opportunities for people who need to be home because of their disability, or they live in a remote area, all sorts of things. So I think that's that progression technology and that inclusion, that crossover between it. Like most people working in the industry, I fell into accessibility by accident. And once you learn about it and start working in it, you can't get enough. It's a really fun career to work in, and you feel like you're on the forefront of technology, making sure people have access to stuff. Once you learn about accessibility, there's no going back, I think.
No, it's great. Thank you. Thea, did you want to add to anything from your kind of your family situation, but anything else that come up now that you know a little bit about the accessibility space?
Yeah, I think inherently, like, design isn't good if it's not accessible. Like, if you're designing something and 20-30%, whatever amount of people can't actually use it or use it as it should be used, then it's just inherently poor. And I think, like, having my mum being visually impaired, I've seen a lot of these things and heard a lot of these things from her, where she's magnifying a website to like 400%, and suddenly the top navigation is taking up the entire page, and she's like, I just can't use this, or using screen readers, or like text to speech, like tons of stuff. And so I've heard a lot from her, and then I've sort of gone out into the world and taken more notice of those things. And it's like, I can use everything pretty much as intended, but to see her not be able to and to have such a different experience, it's just, it's just so, it's ridiculous that not everyone can use something as it should be able to be used, especially when so many things are so simple.
No, that's great. And just as people are calling, please feel free to put your name and your role in the chat, and who you pay your respects to. I know there's a few people joining us as you come in. I know, Kylie, if you're on the call, if you could just manage those questions, and please put questions in the chat. We've got some pretty amazing people on this panel today that you can, pick their brains and get some ideas. Please put your questions in the chat. We've got a few here to go through, but we'd love to come to yours as well. You can also put your hand up and we'll find a spot to bring in your question. So just a little bit more, we kind of touched on getting started in accessibility, but how do you get started, or how do you share with people getting started to understand accessibility for design? Would you like to go first, Claire?
Yeah, I guess it's particularly working in design, getting started with accessibility. I think, like Chris said before, small chunks is always a good way to get started. People often are hesitant to learn about accessibility because it seems very overwhelming. You hear about WCAG and you look at it, and it's not a very easy document to read if you're not working in that space all the time in terms of working out like what actually is a requirement for me as a designer. So I always work with people in looking at the context of something you're perhaps currently working on. So say if I'm redesigning a page and I'm looking at the typography structure, just learning a little bit in that context of what makes typography more accessible, how do I pick a more accessible font, and looking at it in that one problem space. You end up learning a lot as you go along. Trying to learn everything all at once in any industry is going to be really difficult. So just perhaps looking at a particular problem space and then learning about that, you'll build up knowledge a lot quicker, kind of in that contextual space.
That's great. And Thea, what about you? What have you seen as the understanding of accessibility in design and how to get started, basically?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very much in the middle of this process myself, having only started really working on it in the past couple years. I very much echo everything Claire has to say. I think it can be very overwhelming, and it's the kind of thing where you don't want to make mistakes and you don't want to do things wrong because you're trying to make things better for people. And I think that can be very stressful, and it's almost like a fear of failing can prevent you from starting. That's how I sort of felt to begin with. And so I think those small steps are really important, and knowing that even if you're just, fixing your color contrast or increasing your minimum type size, like even those sort of small steps, they'll take you in the right direction. You can slowly build your skills as you learn about everything, because there are so many people with so many different needs, and you're just basically trying to do the best you can and just take it slowly.
That's right. And obviously surround yourself with people that you can touch base with and check in on. Obviously that connection that, you had some questions about a design that you were doing and talking to Claire at a meet at an event, those kinds of things. We're as in the accessibility space, I think we are all open to those kinds of opportunities where we want to share what we've learned and then learn and keep learning. I'm learning something every day. What about you, Chris? So how do you getting started? What kind of thing?
Well, I find if we're talking specifically, well, this is general, but for UX folks in particularly, I find it's a really good sort of way to get your foot in the door of trigger people's empathy. A lot of times people are not, thankfully, very few people get out of bed in the morning and say, I'm going to leave people out today. It's really a matter of people simply not knowing or simply not having that inclusive design mentality where you design something visual and beautiful, but then you have to go through a couple of different steps of, okay, what about this user type? What about this type of user? What about this type of user? And that just doesn't come naturally. We are naturally have a bias to sit down and design people that look like us and act like us. So you really have to teach people to do that. I find that simply walking UX folks through the needs, and again, gradually, like Claire said, it's especially with the design community trying to go through WCAG. WCAG is scary. It is by its necessity, with the number system, which always reminds me of the Dewey Decimal System for libraries. As soon as, I remember getting started. So I try to keep my mentality of like, what was it like for me if an accessibility person said, what are you doing? That's a 1.4.5. And I'm like, this is frightening and overwhelming. So going at it instead from a user-driven perspective and say, okay, it looks like this combo box is doing some complicated, unexpected stuff, for example. What's important visually that we need to get to somebody that can't see the page, for example, and walk through those exercises. But I'll echo Claire with, a little bit at a time, start gradually. And actually on this note, kind of, I said it with the WCAG guidelines, there's a psychological thing to getting designers and everybody in general into it. We can't, as accessibility pros, pound the desk and say, no, this isn't good enough. We have to say, hey, if you've started doing accessibility and this page is 20% more accessible than it was, you've done a great job. Okay,
Yeah.
keep it up. And then let's move to 30 and let's move to 40. It's natural. I know a lot of people do get frustrated because sometimes changes happen so slow or things regress. But I think it's really important, as much as we can, be really like positive and supporting and almost like parental about helping people get on board. Yeah.
No, that's great. And we've even got obviously some great commentary happening in the chat here. And one of the questions is kind of touched on that I'd like to bring up is, as a professional in the alley design field, how do you negotiate to fix accessibility issues you see with your manager? So maybe some more of that practical, we're going to come up and talk about, ideas on tools to make accessible design a regular part of your process. Where's that kind of crossover that you can bring in, negotiations to fixes in your role? So I might start with you, Claire. How would you do that?
Yeah, I think especially in the design space, when you say you get a bug from an order or you find a problem, being able to communicate who is actually being impacted by it and why and how is really important for that negotiating to get it fixed. If you just say like, this is a WCAG failure because blah, that doesn't sound like an important thing to fix from someone coming from the outside. So being able to really clearly advocate for the user and explain how they're going to be impacted, what different user groups, really helps to advocating for something getting fixed. Especially in design is very subjective. There's always lots of stakeholders trying to insert their opinions into things. So being able to clearly advocate, like, I'm not just changing this just because I want to, there's a clear user need here, and addressing how it can be impacted and why it will be improved is really important. And we obviously, as accessibility consultants, we get this a lot with teams that they're trying really hard to make something accessible, but they're just getting pushback from higher ups trying to advocate for change. The most successful avenue always comes from that very heavy user focus, and we have to advocate their users' needs and how they're being impacted.
And totally the evidence, right? So, if you can show a video of someone not being able to, click the submit button, or that will put the shopping trolley or anything to get that final, buy what they're looking to buy, then showing them that's a barrier is a huge bit of evidence that's quite valuable, I think, across the board. And Chris, do you have some tips in that space? Like what can you do to negotiate for those accessibility issues?
Yeah, and I think it's something that we all have to do in big corporations and organizations, because for example, in the big software companies, they do feel pressure from the stock market to be the first one to get something to market. And so I find that it's hard, but you have to be able to do some horse trading. So one thing that comes to mind is, if you did a test on, say, a page or a product, let's say you had found 500 issues. If you take that spreadsheet of 500 issues and send it over to the product team, they're going to feel deflated and overwhelmed. And they're going to be like, we can't even do this in this sprint or another one. So being able to prioritize the issues, I think, is important. You're going to get more impact, and it's going to help the teams with focusing their level of effort. If we say, okay, how do we negotiate this? Of these 500, 30 of these are severe blockers. Like, let's put a label on these in whatever the software system is to make sure these get addressed first. And so doing things in sort of waves like that. And I've used this approach with different teams I've worked with, and you get farther than trying to get around all 500 at once. So within that, there are a couple of different ways, and this might be getting a little bit more into development, but it is part of the negotiation. Let's say you've got, how can you take that overwhelming or large pile of work and break it into chunks? So you might say, hey, this release or this sprint, just fix the tables. And then you can have a developer or a couple of developers learn table accessibility and then line up those issues and knock them out efficiently.
Yeah.
Or let's see, severity, impact, or the last thing I want to say on this is horse trading around level of effort. Let's say you've got two pretty severe issues and helping the team understand, hey, if there's one that you can knock out in 2 or 4 hours, do that. And if the other one takes 40 hours, we can deal with that later. But helping get accessibility, into the mix of the existing workflow, it's tricky, but those are my tips.
No, that's great. And I think too, the idea of like, taking it into chunks or something to prioritize, if a user can't hit that submit button or hit that, I'm going to buy this, then that obviously would be a higher priority because they're not finishing that approach, or there's those kinds of actions, that button's not working. Let's fix that first as a priority. So what about you, Thea? What have you seen as like how you've managed your workload and working with your teams? Have you had to kind of help negotiate where there's accessibility? Like what have you learned so far?
Yeah, I mean, for context, I've only been in my full-time job for like 2 months now, so it's all quite new to me. But
congratulations.
Thank you, Brie. In the experience I have had so far, I think it's kind of about finding opportunities to make these smaller improvements. So if a certain screen or page or workflow or component is being updated, then take that as an opportunity to make those little additional fixes and accessibility improvements in the moment, because you can kind of sneak them in a sense and then send them off to the tech team and then they'll implement it. And it's just about having that awareness of what you can change quickly that doesn't necessarily require a massive overhaul, because I think that is where that resistance can come in. But by making the small changes when things are already being changed, you kind of just wrap it all together, essentially. That's what I've seen so far, at least.
Yeah.
If I can add on that, and I think it kind of echoes it, I've had more success getting people committed to building accessibly moving forward, than instead of going back and fixing stuff that's already built in production. And I did at a different role have a negotiation with a manager, and she said, hey, on the old stuff, we'll fix the 2 priority levels, but on our new stuff, we will shoot for 100% WCAG compliance. And I said, well, of course, she was my manager, so I didn't have a lot of negotiating position, but that worked out well. And after months, the system improved with a moving forward kind of target.
No, that's a good point. It comes down to some of these kind of tools and things that can help support us to make accessible design, and things like design systems and those kinds of things where you can actually build that in. You still have to do a lot of testing, but at least agreements, palette colors. I know that in my time that in the design space, a separate brand company, design company will do the branding, and none of those things will be accessible. But that's our palette now. You can't change it. Some tips around those kinds of things. What kind of tools and negotiations around design systems and palettes and those kinds of things that you think can help designers make things more accessible? Claire, do you have some ideas for that?
Yeah, on design systems, being beholden to a design system can be really good for accessibility or really bad for accessibility. Like you just said, if you're starting, say, with a design system that's not very accessible and you don't have scope to make improvements to it or work around it, it can result in a consistently inaccessible product. Compared to the inverse, if you have a really solid, good design system, you'll create a consistently accessible product. In terms of design systems, some of the best ones that I've worked with have a lot of documentation to support accessibility and explaining like why things are the way they are and how to implement them well and accessible. When there isn't that supporting information there, sometimes they just get used wrong or a color is used in the wrong spot. So that's really important as well. I think what For projects overall, what is a really good supporting factor is when accessibility is not mandated, but like encouraged somewhere. There's some kind of perhaps in your change process, there's rules around what's allowed to go live, what WCAG level you're trying to meet, what are your goals as a company for accessibility. A lot of the time when you don't have those overarching goals, accessibility goals in place, it's very directionless. People don't know when they can make improvements or what priority bugs need to be fixed. So having that overarching change management rules, something like that is really helpful. I saw someone mention checklists in the chat before as well. Having role-based checklists is a really handy thing, particularly if you have worked with some organizations that have stage gates before, say, a design moves on to testing. It has to go through a checklist, has to be peer reviewed. So having little things like that is really helpful as well.
No, that's great. What about you, Taya? What kind of tools have you used since you've started in the accessibility world and in your new job as well? Are there some that really stand out for you?
Yeah, I think as far as what I've worked on so far, which has been at my old job, we were setting up a brand new design system. Now I've come into it where there's an existing one, and that definitely has its own challenges because when you're setting it up and you know about these things, you can kind of bake it in and keep everything, like have all those considerations set from the beginning. But when you come in, like when things are already existing, it's a lot harder to sort of, if things are not accessible, it's a lot harder to work with them moving forward. And then as a junior, there's different dynamics around that. But sorry, I think I've strayed from the question. So tools, yeah, I think a lot of the ones I've focused around is color. I think that's probably one of the biggest things that I've been considering setting up design systems. And so I like using coolers to create palettes. So that's like colors, but with a double O at the start, and they have like a contrast checker. And so I'll sort of jump between and be checking the contrast of different combinations, which is good. And then I know in Figma itself, there's Stark, which is one that Brie actually introduced me to, which has a whole suite of different tools that you can use. So that's one I've used quite frequently when I'm checking things in the designs, which makes life really easy.
Yeah, no, that's great. What about you, Chris? You've got some tools and like designs that the processes that you kind of see improve the accessibility in design and that kind of process aspects, similar to what Claire shared.
Yeah. And I'll mention that for me, this is also a work in progress of something I'm trying to find the right amount in. Claire mentioned about the documentation. I'm trying to find the right amount of information to make available to designers, but keep it lightweight enough that they can use it easily. And I've got sort of blurry ideas in my head of, how do we come up with, let's say a Figma file that has all the standard ARIA patterns in them, but it's brief, it's quick, it's easy on the eyes to find what you need, but then link deeper either into a different Figma file, let's say on a tree, for example, so that we don't overwhelm the designer with all the ARIA and technical information, but make available to them so they know what should the keyboard behavior be that's expected with, and what is the screen reader announcement. So a challenge, and it's fun to me with accessibility, is you need a lot of collaboration between your designers and your developers. It's not so easy as just taking a Figma file visually and passing it down the line and saying, okay, make it look like it looks, use CSS. There's a lot more sophisticated stuff in there. So for example, a UX person does not need to know how to code ARIA widgets, right? But they do need to know what are the ARIA widgets available and how do they work. And so there needs to be constant communication. So anything that helps with design dev handoff and gets those two teams talking is helpful. So in support of that, like the Figma talk I did and we talked about earlier, the accessibility annotation toolkits and getting designers to think about it and put as much notes as they can that help sort of facilitate the handoff to developers, that answers the questions. We don't want the developers forced to basically come up with the accessibility UX. We want them to be part of the conversation, but I've seen that happen in many different teams where UX didn't plan it out. Developers did some Google searches and did the best they could, and then it goes to production and it's wrong. So yeah, there's that, and sort of a partner piece to that. Same problem of how do you organize the right amount. But if we can have either a website or a Figma file, lightweight reference resources for designers that allow them to link or tunnel in, that's what I'm working on and trying to find the sweet spot on now. Yeah.
It comes down to, the design and making it functional, isn't it, really? So, you've got this wonderful design and you said, send it off to the developer, and I've seen it so many times. They see a button, and they might not know about accessibility, know that it should be, coded as a button, not a link. So it's just kind of that cross learning that happens when you do collaborate together. What do you think, Claire? Is that kind of useful as well, that collaboration? Do you encourage that as well of your team?
I guess it's like more, I guess in bigger organizations, there's like other people, I guess, as well, like your content team, collaborating with the designers and the developers, and more collaboration that happens on the initial side of things, but also in that bug resolution stage, the better. It's never like one person's fault that something happened. Everyone, the whole team coming together and working on accessibility helps that cross education as well. If just one person in your team's the one accessibility person and no one else thinks about it, it's not going to be very manageable in the long run. The more people that are actively working together, and it's kind of like a team effort, the easier it is in the long run. The reason I mentioned content as well is a lot of organizations I've worked with recently have a separate content team. Quite often the pages are designed and built and in a test, and then the content's added afterwards. And quite often that's the step where a lot of the accessibility things unintentionally come in, because they weren't part of that initial collaboration. So it's always important to think about those external marketing content, those other people that are touching on the design as well. Yeah,
I mean, they're called Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So it's bring the content in there, and it's how you lay it out and navigate through it, those kinds of things. We've got a great question here from the chat, and lots of discussion going on. Thank you, everyone. Please put more of your questions in the chat for Kylie to grab for us. There's one here about establishing a marriage between the technical aspects of accessibility and that of the emotional intelligence aspect of psychology to encompass this desired approach. It's a kind of a big question. So, what kind of ways do you see, and maybe this is where the content comes in, some kind of plain language and those kinds of things. Where can you just see design helping, a better approach for emotional intelligence? I'm going to go to you first, Chris, if you're comfortable with that question.
I caught the emotional intelligence part. How could you rephrase it or sum up the question?
So I'm just reading the question out. Kylie, is there more to the context of that question that you might like to share? You can come on, unmute and share that, if you feel comfortable.
Down here too.
Yeah, sorry, just having some difficulties with tech at the moment. So looking through the chat, I didn't see any additional context, but I'm just having a quick read from it. Maybe, I think, Henry, you've raised it. Would you like to unmute yourself and...
hi, Henry. Yeah, please do. Please ask your question and see if we can clarify a bit more.
Hi. So basically what I'm trying to get at is, because we have a technical understanding of what the requirements are when it comes to designing things. We follow a compliance. There's a whole bunch of frameworks that's there. However, from my perspective and just my experience only, because my business area, we manage a number of projects, we have to uplift it to the cloud. And basically the skill sets are very technical. and they follow a scope of requirements as per the project. However, there seems to be a missing component, which is it's a bit difficult to explain, but there seems to be a gap in terms of the stakeholder engagement from the project side. You have a scope of requirements, but then there's something lost in translation. There's something missing. And
Is it the user? Is it the user, do you think, Henry?
Yeah, I don't think the requirements actually cover the disability side of things. It doesn't. Yeah, sorry, it's a bit sort of complicated to explain.
So I can take a swing at it if you want, because what I'm sort of hearing is almost getting organizational or cultural change, especially in a large organization. And I found your question and resistance. So there are a couple of things. We already touched on the empathy piece. That's gonna work more for designers and developers, but the people doing the actual work. And it's not going to work with everybody, but
yeah,
handful of people, some subsection of the people will get excited about accessibility work and maybe become accessibility professionals. Hopefully, if we make the case right, people will understand that this is part of their job, but we need to be really nice about it. We can't pound the desk and say, this is just your job. You're not doing your job. Because that creates negative feelings around accessibility. But if you have people that are excited about accessibility or people with different disabilities on your team that are happy to be public, that helps automatically engage people's empathy. And that's what ends up getting known as sort of grassroots accessibility or bottom up within an organization. People getting excited about it, talking about it, and talking about it at the kickoff and talking about it at the handoff starts to slowly socialize. And sometimes organizations will call these people the accessibility champions. Maybe they'll have a meeting once a month and talk about what accessibility is looking like on their team. So it's almost a loose bottom-up network. You need to have, well, for the best success, from what I've seen, you also need leadership to make sure it's clear that this is part of the values, and they can't do it just once, because people working at companies, again, are kind of like if your parents tell you as when you're a kid, like, this is the new rule, but they don't enforce it and they never say it again, you're going to see what you can get away with. So I encourage leaders to, when you do that quarterly meeting, say, this is part of our values. This is part of how you do stuff. And I think this is related to a different question. If you get pushback around level of effort or increased effort, the argument I use is, well, yes, it does, but of course we're excluding part of the user group, up until then. But if we think about it from the start and design it correctly from the beginning, that's going to have the lowest amount of impact. So I don't know. I hope that's sort of in the target of what you were asking about, but org changes, it doesn't happen overnight.
I'd love to jump in on that aspect you mentioned, Henry, around like that focus on technical compliance. I find that a lot of people have that where they're writing acceptance criteria or requirements, and they are very technical heavy. So if you're looking for some resources that have requirements written in a more user-focused way, I'd recommend looking at COGA, which is a supporting document to WCAG. It has the cognitive guidelines in there. So those are often written a lot more user-focused. I'll just grab the link to the COGA quick. Is a really good resource because it has it all written down and organized in a really clear way.
Yeah, thanks,
Claire. That's great, Claire. And we've had this link in our Ask the Professionals quite regularly. So it's a great one to bring up. And the
other ones are, I've been working a lot with the ISO plain language standard. that's written in such a fabulous, clear way if you can get your hands on that. Unfortunately, a lot of those standards are like paper license documents, but if you can get in there, that is such an incredible document. That's every requirement in there is written in a really user-focused way. It has a lot of stuff up front around preparing to write content, and at the end about working with users to review content. And the other one that has a lot of user statement stuff is EN 301549. Another requirement has a lot of those user statements that are focused
Functional
on
performance statements. Yeah,
that's
yeah,
it.
exactly.
I was going a
Section
bit
4.
blank on that.
No, exactly right. And if you need to too, it was something I was discussing yesterday with a few people is around the disability action plan that you have for your organization. Is there someone in that plan who is accountable that you can go to and say, you know, we need to kind of link this back to what our business case is for our digital, you know, a disability action plan. If you don't have one, then obviously you need to get one. And a lot of government departments should have a disability action plan of some kind that you should, you can review and see if there is someone accountable that can help you set this up. It might be someone in HR, it might be somewhere else. Get them to start the conversation as well. There's also those user stories that Intopia put out as well. I think, Claire, I need to get some links for those as well. You can put acceptance criteria in your
yeah, I'll grab the
yeah,
link to that. It's a beta
that.
tool at the moment, so not all components are in there yet.
It's
but
wonderful.
Essentially,
I love it.
it's all guidance written by our team on components, so you can put in there what component you're building, and it will have a bunch of acceptance criteria pre-written, because that can be one of the main things. A hold up for project teams is every time you're making a new ticket to make a new component, and then you have to write out the acceptance criteria and look into like what standards does it need to meet. So it's handy having a quick way of getting through that.
Exactly. What about you? Sorry, yeah, Chris.
Oh, I just wanted to add something quick on Henry's question. Just because he mentioned being with government, we talked about, hey, how do we activate people's empathy and sort of lead with the human angle? And that's always what I would start with. But depending on what country we're talking about, the legal requirements for government entities, for their employees and for the general public are getting stronger and stronger. So if you don't win the battle of getting people's sort of hearts into it, that's what these laws are for. If you can't motivate the organization, there might be external penalties, which are more expensive or more negative than ignoring accessibility. I don't know if that helps. Sorry.
Yeah, no. So Henry's in Australia. We don't have the strength of that kind of focus at the moment, but there is some work being done, and I think even the driver of the European Accessibility Act, you know, knowing that there's a lot of Australian companies who have been a little bit lax and don't understand accessibility. If they ever want to sell to Europe, they're going to have to meet that legislation. So, you know, they're going to have to meet it, and otherwise they're going to be, you know, there's going to be penalties from the member states for them. So, and we're doing some work in OZeWAI around that coming up over August. Keep an eye out or check on the website for some workshops in that space around accessibility policies and legislation change. Australian Human Rights Commission, Claire Intopia has been involved in that to get that advisory note updated so that it has more of that you know, driver of what kind of things you can do to build better products, including design. So, Thea, are you aware of anything in your organization, like a disability action plan or anything like that helps support you in your accessibility advocacy and design?
I don't think I've come across anything.
Yeah.
But I did do a lot of reading when I first joined, so it might have been in there somewhere, but I'm not currently aware of anything.
Yeah, and I guess it's also, you know, understanding if there's, you know, disability reference groups that you can touch on and talk to, you know, and take the evidence, you know, say that there's some blockers. That's where WCAG can help, right? You can actually show that some things are not working in that space. But and look, if we do have some government case studies for you, Henry, we will look out for them. We're actually developing a few of those for the Future Skills Organisation. And appreciate everyone here supporting OZeWAI in this kind of advocacy work that we need in Australia to make these changes happen. please join some of our workshops, join OZeWAI, support us so that we can actually keep doing this advocacy work in this space. I might just come back a little bit to some of the questions that we have here, unless there's something else that Kylie's come up with. So encountering questions on incorporating research with diverse users during the design phase. What's your go-to advice for project teams in that space? Claire, would you like to go first?
Yes, particularly I feel like for design and UX teams, the main hurdle that people find is just not knowing where to start, or assuming that they can't do user testing with people with disabilities at the design stage. They have to wait till something's built. But the main advice I normally like to give is to think about what you're trying to learn with your product. Say if you're redesigning a certain page, what are your goals? What are you trying to learn about it? Not just blindly thinking I have to test this to throw it out and get it tested. What are you trying to learn from it? And then adapt your designs to suit that goal. So say your content team's just rewritten a bunch of content to match the plain language ISO standard, and then thinking about how to test that. You don't need a full prototype to just test your content. You can just have someone read it. Perhaps you're rebuilding a mega menu. You can think about that by getting the old one tested and then talking to people about what you could do to improve it. There are a lot of ways to test things. On a prototype level, quite often people are concerned, particularly for users of assistive technologies, how do you get them to test a prototype? There's lots of ways to do that. And then recruitment often is a big hurdle for users. Design teams is, how do I recruit people? If you're working in a large organization and you have an internal accessibility team that you can reach out to, I think I saw Henry mention in the chat that you have an internal disability support area. So getting internal people in your organization is a good starting place, or working with organizations to help with recruitment. There's a lot of organizations out there that help recruit users. You can talk about your goals and what type of users you want to work with, and they'll help you with that recruitment stage. We have a team, Intopia Connect, that do that. They can help recruit all the way up to run the sessions for you. So just getting some support where you're not sure.
Yeah.
And you can run testing with anyone at any stage of your project is the important thing to keep in mind.
No, that's great. And in our OZeWAI, we have some inclusive research workshops. We run through some of those kind of things as well. Some practical things like giving yourself a little bit of extra time. It comes down to your planning for what you're doing and which users you're going to, which cohort, or, the types of users you might want to test at each time. So Thea, you've done a bit of this in some of the previous work that we did together. What did you find around incorporating research with other users? What did you find that was valuable to learn at the design stage?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of my thoughts have already been said by Claire, to be honest. I think it's just about actively thinking about it and not just expecting it to happen. Like if you want to test with people with diverse needs, you need to have that consideration, plan for it, recruit those people. And it can be a harder process because, like Claire said, often you don't know where to start and you're not sure where to go to. And if you've got the luxury of having an accessibility team, that sounds fantastic. But there's just so much value to be had from testing with people who do have, diverse requirements. And if you can test with them earlier rather than later, that's better, because no matter how much we may know or don't know in terms of accessibility, people with lived experience know best. And if you can hear from them sooner, then the sooner you can make your product better, pretty much.
That's great. What about you, Chris? About this research aspect and teams?
Yeah, I personally have not done a lot of formal research with folks with disabilities, but I can share on my sort of hack or informal approach. Something that's worked nicely, I've worked with teams where, and I love this, when they're designing a new component, they'll start off doing a competitive analysis. So they'll look in the other big design systems and other products and look for ways that these things have been done for all users. So let's, we could say a date picker, and they'll analyze how it works. Then if I have the links to where I can find those, then I can go and do some keyboard testing and screen reader testing and get a feel for the variety of implementations. And then I work with a handful of basically friends and connections that are daily screen reader users, and basically get a second opinion of, hey, it seems like this one works, these three work really well, but as Thea said, my experience, I'm not a daily screen reader user. I use it a lot for testing, but I always have the aid of my site to sort of verify what's happening. So it's always great to get that opinion of, hey, check out these 3 different date pickers.
Yeah.
Which one works best for you and what snags you run into, and then can take that information and use that to guide any tweaks that need to be made to the design, or influence the keyboard or screen reader behavior of the component or page.
That's great. And also, I guess that's where the design systems that do have their accessibility aspects to it can actually help you as well, because you can learn from those, that why they've decided that made those decisions. Especially date pick is a good one. Making sure there's a free field for someone to put the date in as themselves and not pick it if they need to. Claire, some ideas around some of those kind of processes that you would think of for research with diverse teams, particularly earlier when you haven't got design. So do you work on that earlier with your researchers as a designer as well?
Yeah, like as I mentioned before, there's a lot of things you can do before you even started designing, looking at particularly if you're starting with an existing site or product and you're revamping it, there's a lot of stuff you can do up front in terms of looking at what is currently accessible on the website. It's always good to think about too, like what do users love? You don't want to take away something that is working really well and is really accessible for people in your redesign. Looking at what the current challenges of the site are to making sure you're not repeating them, and talking to users about how they interact with the site currently, what would they like to see done better in the next iteration. That's always a good place to start, particularly when you're doing UX research around content and IA. There's a lot of things you can do with that upfront before you start designing as well, and making sure you're including a lot of different users in that general research process as well.
Yeah. And I think from that, are you seeing where it gets done well at that stage, that how it improves the accessibility later? Have you noticed that kind of there's less of that, I have to do an audit at the end because I've been considering things earlier? Is it those kinds of things that come into play when you do it? So what we call the shift left, right? So what else are you seeing?
Definitely, when a lot of that research and design work is done for accessibility up front, then instead of like quite often as an accessibility consultancy, we're doing first-time audits where companies come in and they're getting a first-time audit, and you spend a lot of time with the basics. You're raising a lot of tickets around headings, contrast, all those kind of basic things. But when you've done a lot of that work up front, then at the end, you're focusing on niche, complex bugs. We found this when we were working with the Australian Census. By the time they got to the end, we were looking at really, really niche things like iPad voiceover had one specific bug on one specific field, and making sure we're tackling things like that rather than the design and the interaction design that can all be done up front. Then you can really focus on the really sticky problems and kind of unweave those later on, rather than spending all of your valuable time once it's in production on the basics.
No, that's right. What about you, Chris, when it comes to things like accessibility audits? There's a lot of discussion in the accessibility space that they're not really useful. People they're not doing anything with them. Hopefully people are as making it a baseline. But are you seeing a change if you do bring in something earlier, even at research, that you are doing less of those baseline checks at the end?
Yeah, as you said, the shift left approach is the way to do it. I mean, people are making so much more work for themselves if they only think about it at the end of QAing. Like I mentioned earlier about that, you have 500 issues. There's a psychological problem of tackling that. And when you get a 20-page audit, I'll look at something like that and I'm just, oh, deflated. Like, oh, that's gonna, you know, so the more, this is back on the theme of how do you chop it up. As far as doing, I mean, I think audits are a necessary part. And if you have that in your culture of your organization, that's a great way to demonstrate the effectiveness of shifting left. If you have a baseline with a bunch of nasty audits and you start fixing it more proactively, something I've had to do, and we talked about this maybe adjacently a little bit with content or how things can get broken in the line. I've worked with different teams where there's a myth of, oh, our design system or our component library is accessible, therefore we're accessible. And at every link down the chain, there's a possibility of breaking stuff or introducing new issues. So I've seen cases where, and I'm sure others on this call have too, like component A, totally accessible. Component B, totally accessible. But when you put A into B or just on the same page, you've got new interaction errors. So the message I try to get in there is keep doing what you're doing with the component system, and hopefully it'll make testing at each of these waypoints a lot more lightweight, but you will catch stuff because people come up with ways you didn't think of. One example off the top of my head that I thought was funny. I worked with a client a long time ago. They created a little, it was called like the quick tasks menu. So you had an item on the page, several items, and they designed it so it was a button. You get 4 little things that come up, and it's compact and easy, and it was built accessibly. Well, that went out to the product teams, and they ended up, instead of taking 4 items, they put like 8 items in it and introduced a scroll bar in this tiny space. And then they translated it to German, and all the words that were in there became 2 or 3 times as long. So it introduced horizontal scroll bars too. So that's a case I've brought up before, saying people will find ways to break your well-intentioned design in production, and you can test it.
No, exactly right. That's a great example as well. So the biggest challenges, I guess, and initially I've got the question here around engaging people with lived experience during the design phase, but I think just generally, what are the challenges in the design, in the accessibility? You kind of, overlapping as a UX in the UX field between the researchers and the developers. Collaboration is really important. What other things is really important in understanding accessibility in design and getting that across to other teams? A lot of us are very visual. We still love things to look pretty and look design. What other barriers are you seeing for accessibility? Thea, do you have some examples there of what you see?
Yeah, I mean, from my experience, I think it's that cross communication. So like even on this call, like listening to Chris talk about ARIA level setups, I'm not exactly sure what they are, and I've seen some stuff about it before, but I don't actually understand what it means exactly. And like learning about that, like if that's something I know about, then I can actually implement that in the designs that I'm doing before they go to the tech team. And if the tech team understands things more about like color contrast and ratios and things like that, then like if I send them a design that doesn't quite look right, but I didn't pick up on it, then they could call it out and come back to me. So I think it's where there's different elements of accessibility that are considered at the different steps in the process of like designing and production. If you know about the different things in those different places and there is that communication, then you can design a lot better of a product from just like, I guess, what's the word I'm trying to find? Consistency, I suppose. Like it sort of goes through every step instead of being like pieced together bit by bit, if that makes sense.
And then there's that iteration. I mean, that's where Agile comes in as quite a good process, because you do collaborate a lot more in that if it's done correctly. What about you, Claire? What are you seeing as some of the other barriers, or some of the good things that are happening in the design space that are helping that collaboration from research and development?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of teams I've worked with that do it really successfully are doing like true Agile, where it's very like actual thinking about users and people rather than processes. they're working they don't have big, huge Jira setups and backlogs and all of this extra process. It's just a small team. They're communicating really well. They have that, like Taylor was saying, that cross-pollination of skills where they're kind of, the more you collaborate, the more you understand different people's roles and skills, and you learn from each other. And just having those like small, really highly collaborative teams do that process really well, because they're thinking about the problems and communicating really closely and really focused on the user and making a good product, rather than it being about this big process. But obviously with a lot of large orgs comes with that. So the more you can kind of work in small clusters on different parts of a product, that works really well, I think.
No, excellent. What about you, Chris? Some of those crossover.
Well, let's see. This might drift a little far from the question, but two things came to mind. And some of you will I believe you mentioned earlier some of the hurdles to get over. And one thing with design teams is the myth that accessible design can't be good visual design. Or that accessibility is a constraint on creativity. And so I try to educate teams and flip it around that say, this is a design challenge like other things. Can you be visually excellent and visually innovative while still making...
I love that approach. That's great. Yeah.
But one thing I run into kind of on the note, and I don't see this going away, is visual designers in UX and design school. I feel like in some ways they're driven to innovate. They're driven to come up with something new that the world has never seen before. Not everybody, but some people. And I've seen this in organizations. And the team says, aha, we made something really cool. It's a combo widget that does A and also B. And it hasn't been done before, so we don't have a standard or a go-by to look at for accessibility. And then it becomes a new novel interface for a keyboard or screen reader user that they have to learn, and we have to be really careful. So there's just a tension that will always be there to, hey, follow the standards. Why make it, what you've got here, you've designed it in a very interesting way, but it's a set of checkboxes, okay? You can code it like checkboxes and everybody will know how to do it, but people will say, oh, well, that's boring. So trying to navigate that, make sure there's innovation, new design, and coming up with ways to make sure that's accessible is an ongoing challenge in my world.
Exactly right. And I think mega menus, when they first came in, were one of those kind of navigation aspects of, how does someone navigate a simple menu? We had a lot of discussion in the OZeWAI conferences early on around that tipping point of arrows and tabs, and how to kind of jump between those different aspects. And again, but some of the standards are, coming up with some innovative ways. The skip links, allowing you to jump between those different sections are quite clever. I think you actually mentioned it in the Figma design, how you kind of use that for, a content management system, where you have a lot of interactive components. And I think that's an important point with design too, is that there's going to be a lot of interaction. So, considering that you do have to work with, whoever's going to develop that interaction to make sure it works. Thea, we've been through that a few times. And so what are your go-to resources for accessibility for designers? And look, I'm sorry, I just realized I was supposed to let you know when we were halfway through. So if people want to take a stretch, grab a glass of water or a coffee, we're actually already, we only have half an hour left. So it's been such a wonderful discussion. But yeah, Thea, your go-to resources for accessibility for designers, what would you like to share with people that's been useful for you?
Yeah, can I answer that in a minute? I just wanted to add on to what Chris was saying previously.
Please do.
Just because talking about design school is one of the things that I can talk to the most strongly, having just gone through it. And I 100% agree that there's very much the pressure to be doing innovative, different things going throughout school. And so I did the Bachelor of Design in Visual Communication at UTS, for context for everyone. And like that was very much the way. And the thing about it was that accessibility just was not talked about. Like, I don't think I had a single class where we actually touched on it throughout my 3 years of doing it. I actually only started looking at inclusive and accessible design in my double degree, which I did for a 4th year. So it was like, it wasn't even a topic of consideration. So the idea of, you know, being able to have things flying off the page and be using funky color combinations and like the weirdest but like coolest new trendy font you could find, like that was very much what we were being pushed to do. And you could see that the people who were doing well were people who were really pushing the boundaries. But if I look back through everything I did in that time, so much of it would just absolutely fail any type of accessibility checks. Like, it would have been pretty awful, not gonna lie. And so I think there's a bigger piece here for new designers coming in of actually having accessibility talked about in schools, so that you don't come into the world and all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, that might be a good thing to consider. Thanks, school. But
So,
yes.
well, before you get to your resources, I'm going to go to Claire and Chris. And what would you like to see happen to bring accessibility in earlier in design? Besides, you know, just bringing it into the studies, what other things can happen to do you think, to make that shift and that change earlier in the thinking of UX designers? Claire, would you like to go first?
Obviously the education side does come into it. Like, I did the same degree as Thea, and the same, like, you don't get taught about accessibility at all. So making sure like those skills are available in the job market for people coming out of uni, high school, etc., is still important. That not having those skills available in the market often is a big hurdle for people. They want to uplift their workplace, hire people with accessibility skills, but they have trouble finding people, bringing people in. So internal training often is pretty successful for people having onboarding programs that include expectations around accessibility. Where can they learn more internally about accessibility? What information's available? What are the rules? That kind of stuff, making sure that so when someone's onboarded to your team, they straight away know what the expectation is around accessibility. There's training available for them. Things like that can be really great. And having that organizational prioritization of accessibility always helps encourage people to do self-learning and training as well. If you've come on board in a team and you know there is an expectation around building accessible products, you're more motivated to learn about it. I've run training before where you have people in the training that are just there because they've been told to be in the training and they're not engaged. So it's having that motivation to be excited about it and want to learn about it is always going to be a hurdle there.
Yeah. What about you, Chris? What do you think needs to happen earlier? You're finding that in the States as well? There's obviously some more legislation coming through California and things like that could be a driver. You know, developers could actually be sued themselves if they don't create the accessible product that comes into place. That's a bill that's not necessarily through yet, but that's what we've heard. What other things need to happen earlier on in, you know, people's lives if they want to become designers?
Well, you know, I echo the education piece, and yeah, thanks for your comments, Thea, because I haven't seen what the current status of design school is, but we need to balance. I don't know how to approach that. There was for a couple of years, there was a developer boot camp in San Diego, and they'd have, you know, a semester, and the people were there 40 hours a week. They would learn to code and build a website, and they invited me to come and speak to each of these groups, but I got an hour. So it was a fire hose of how much can I touch on. And you know, after I begged and pleaded, I got them to give me an hour and a half per semester per student group, so then I could turn on the screen reader with a site that worked well so that they could hear the results. I find screen reader education for everybody is challenging. I know a lot of accessibility professionals or daily screen reader users, they've got the robotic voice on and they've got the speed turned on really high, and they'll sort of go quickly through the page. And to someone who this is your first or second or third time hearing a screen reader, you need to remember that it's kind of an unusual experience. It's kind of a lot. So I keep my screen reader at a slower speaking pace. I use one of the system voices, so it's less jarring than the robotic NVDA voice. And I basically do a thing where I'm like, okay, we're about to enter a main navigation. You're going to hear role, name. We're going to hear a count of the numbers. All these things paint a picture for someone who can't see. And then I go through it and let it announce really slow. And I said, that was a lot. Let's back up and do it again. So I kind of try to use the kid gloves because again, going back to my own experience getting started, I'm like, it took me a minute to get my head around screen reader expectations and stuff like that. We've already talked about for people getting started, checklists. I use one, and we've touched on this too, plain language. So if it's a group of new UXers, here's our first training. I call it top 10 things UX designers should think about for accessibility. And we touch on the big ones you all know of color is information, color contrast, but again, keep them focused on print out this checklist or keep it on your desktop, mentally go through things before you pass the design down the line. It's not going to be everything, but if you do this, you'll get started. So I don't think I've touched on this yet, but I find it's psychologically very important to give people a little bit to just getting started. So it's a human bias, whether it's designers or developers, to just once you've started doing something and you feel good about it, you want to keep doing it and do more. So if we can find ways to take advantage of that, it's that little piece by piece approach we've been talking about.
That's great. Look, we're down to nearly 15 minutes to go. I'm going to go to the final question about resources, and we'll touch on the screen readers as well, because they're actually very useful. But someone has asked about a good site for demonstration of screen readers. I can share the OZeWAI. If you go to our videos, we have some technical demonstrations of Andrew, who's on the call, using his screen reader to use OZeRetro that we sent back to OZeRetro, and they made fixes on their product thanks to that. It's small little, and you get his sense of humor at the same time. But yeah, do a search. NVDA has some wonderful videos. OZeWAI is putting together some demonstrations for Get Online Week for how to use screen readers. Some pretty simple ones, how to even for seniors who have never used a phone before and their eyesight's going and they now have to use the screen reader. How do they even, find out put a contact in their phone? How do they turn the accessibility features on? Those kinds of things. So keep an eye out for those through OZeWAI and register and support us to deliver those. But also, it's a YouTube. Does anyone else here have some go-to resources for designers about screen readers? Anything else that you think is useful that you'd like to share? Claire, do you have a couple? You've shared some earlier. I know they're wonderful. So that Intopia resource is always good.
Yeah, I guess checking out those two, the acceptance criteria and the checklist, is always really handy for just speeding things up. I always find that the main complaint, the complaint sounds pretty negative, but the kind of pushback I get from design teams is often, I think, Chris, you mentioned it before, like it takes too long. It's adding a lot of extra time onto my process. So having things that you can share with teams to help speed it up, like automating things or having checklists where they can just have a quick, seamless process, often helps with that. If someone feels like, I guess it's the same with anything, people often do this with cyber as well. If they feel like something is going to add a lot of extra time to their workflow, they generally don't want to do it. But in terms of designers, WebAIM is often a really great starting point for users in terms of explaining some of those development concepts in a really good, easy, plain language point of view, making sure that you have tools where you need them. I think Taya mentioned before, making sure that if you're designing Figma, you have all your plugins set up so that you're integrating accessibility into your workflow is really helpful as well.
That's great. What about you, Taya? Some more resources or anything? And come back to that other question.
Yes, we're back. I think when I was first learning about it, like literally just learning about inclusivity and accessibility, one of the first things I found was the UK government posters. And I'll pop a link in the chat to them, but they were just like a really easy breakdown of like a few key sort of disabilities or accessibility needs, and then the easy like do this, don't do this. And that just like from an initial standpoint, just starting out, that was like a really easy way for me to sort of test the waters and like start to understand some of the key simple things you can do. So I encourage you to look at those if you're particularly newer to it. Otherwise, I think a lot of the stuff I learned honestly was from you, Brie, working at Penny. And throughout, there was just tons of stuff that I learned as we went, and you'd call things out about my designs, and that was fantastic. So having people to talk to and learn from is very helpful. And otherwise, I think I don't really have any other like specific resources, but whenever I had a question about something, I would essentially just go off and do my own research. So based on a conversation I had with Claire, actually, I was looking at what sort of fonts were actually accessible and looking into dyslexia and what were dyslexia-friendly fonts, among other things. And so I went to a whole like deep dive looking into, you know, what makes a font accessible and legible and all these types of things. So just, yeah, do your own research in areas that you're not sure about or want to learn more about, I guess would be the rest of my advice.
And continue to test with those users, that's right. Yeah.
Yes,
So
yes.
to validate or to, you know, check that what you're learning is actually correct in those cases. What about you, Chris? What are your go-to resources? You're putting some in the chat, which is great. Thank you.
Yeah, just a couple that come to mind. The other one, let me just finish typing. Newsletter that I like is I don't know if anybody's familiar with Smashing magazine. That's front end and UX, so they cover a lot of stuff with CSS, a lot of general web design stuff, a little bit on coding, but they include accessibility as part of it. Like I think they send out a weekly newsletter, and maybe 1 out of 8 is themed on accessibility. So I like that this is normalizing accessibility as part of the UX conversation.
Exactly.
And they're well written. They get guest writers from all around. Yeah, Smashing is awesome. Okay, so that's not new for everybody here, but check it out. Where else? There's good online training from a lot of the accessibility consultancy companies. I don't know, Claire, does Intopia have like self-paced online classes?
Yeah, we
for
have
one?
e-learn platform. You can find it on the website. We're always adding new courses slowly to it, but there's the design ones up now and the developer ones up.
Awesome.
Yeah, and even on the OZeWAI website, we have a list to Intopia and the other Australian accessibility organisations that run training at a variety of different times. So and please subscribe to our newsletter. We put a lot of the events and training in the OZeWAI newsletter as well for Australians. Although we do get we've got nearly 1,000 subscribers actually, which is pretty cool. So we're waiting for our 1,000th. So maybe they'll get an award with some kind of free learning or something.
Nice.
Anything else, Chris, that you'd like to mention?
I've seen some good courses on LinkedIn Learning too. But there's a lot of good stuff out there. So it's refreshing to see. I probably got into accessibility. I'd have to take a look like 13 years ago, and there was just nothing out there. And I would go to cocktail parties and people would say, "What do you do?" And I would say accessibility. And then I'd have to spend the next 10 minutes trying to explain what that is. And so it's been nice for me because now I can go to a cocktail party and say I do accessibility, and it's far more likely that somebody has some, does that have, is that things with disabilities, or is that making things inclusive. So it's been cool to see accessibility become more and more mainstream and part of the conversation. So I'm optimistic. I run into users. I was talking to someone today and they're like, I think accessibility is getting worse, but that's debatable, but at least it's more part of the consciousness of the conversations I'm seeing in different workplaces.
Yeah, I think I had a conversation with this again this week too around an event that's coming up in Melbourne in August around leadership and what should people be keeping an eye on around accessibility. And I think that idea of as a culture does mature, an internal or an organization culture does mature in accessibility, the work starts to shift differently as well. It's not about that QA testing. It's all about that strategy and how do we, understand our users better. There's a different mindset that comes with that. And I think if you see that in an organization and you can ask about those values to work there, you'll know that they're on a good accessibility pathway compared to those that go, oh, we don't have any of that. And you know that it's going to be a lot harder work for you on the ground route rather than the top down. But anything else that you have, Claire, that anyone else would like to comment on some resources? Yeah.
On that, being involved in the community is always a great way to learn. I learned so much when I first got into accessibility just by going to conferences, going to meetups, being a part of forums. So engaging is always good to have somewhere where you can ask those tricky questions. You're going to learn so much talking to other accessibility nerds rather than learning by yourself. Coming from being a solo accessibility team person where I was just me in a team to working with all accessibility people, you learn so much engaging with people with more experience. So going to conferences, engaging with OZeWAI community, engaging in all the different Slack communities that are out there, just looking around and trying to find a local meetup to you or somewhere where you can find people with experience in your area that can help you out.
That's great, Claire. And we've got a great question here in the chat around anyone willing to answer this. Do we consider qualifications in accessibility valuable? Thea, maybe we'll start with you. Are there qualifications in, I don't know if you've seen that you want to do them, that there's some there. Do you see them as being valuable now that you're starting to learn more?
I honestly haven't really thought about it. Initial impression is, I think someone said this in the chat, but potentially not. Like just based on the trade-off of, I'm assuming how much you have to pay for it, which is probably a reasonable amount based on all these types of qualifications. I think you can learn the stuff without having to pay for a course. And then it's just sort of like focusing on the impact on the user and that sort of emotional, psychological piece, I think is probably more powerful. And like, I guess I just question whether, if I went to a higher up and I said, I've got this qualification in accessibility, we need to do X versus like, I've been talking to users, they showed me this problem, here, have a look, see what they said. I feel like the second would be much more powerful. So yeah. At this point in time, I don't know if it would be weighted highly enough, and it's not something I'm considering. But if in the future that changed, and if Claire or Chris thought it was a good idea, then that would change my opinion.
Yeah, no, that's right. In the UK, they've got a digital accessibility apprenticeships. It's open source. We're looking at that through OZeWAI to see how we can bring those apprenticeships or the open source material of it and bring it to an Australian apprenticeship approach, because you do need that crossover of, you can learn, you can have your qualification and certification kind of thing, but you also need that on the job experience as well, where an apprenticeship really comes in as quite valuable. Chris, what do you think? Is a kind of a qualification or certification valuable, do you think?
I mean, it can't hurt. I got my accreditation through the IAAP, and I put the link in there. But I was working at a different firm and they were willing to pay for it. And they wanted to be able to say to their customers, hey, look, 80% of our people have this certification. Right. So like it or not, certificates are a good way to try to communicate authority to people that don't know any better. So some people, are really impressed, or it it sounds good. And I can tell you the tests that I did have to take for those were tricky and validated, you know, some accessibility and technical knowledge. So I'd say it couldn't hurt, and I don't know the current state of how resumes are screened or how people would be looking at somebody for an accessibility position. I'll tell you that I was looking at hiring some folks that are an accessibility engineer position, and so from that perspective, maybe having that certification might help somebody get through the resume screen, but it really comes down to somebody getting the offers, whether they can answer the questions or not. There were people who I said, here's the interview question. I give you a web page to test. Tell me what your process is. And a couple of people nailed it because they pretty much said what I know is a standard process using automated tools and keyboards and screen readers and etc. And then we did a code test where I said, here is a messed up inaccessible page. I'll email it to you, send it back in 4 hours with a list of the issues you found and fix what you can in the HTML. So I don't know if that kind of takes us away from the question, and I don't know how popular that approach is, but that's what I did to say, oh, this interview went well. You seem to know what you're talking about. Now I need you to prove it before we make you a job offer.
Yeah, no, it's a good thinking of that approach, but maybe it could be brought in earlier as a test in a software engineering class. Here's one of the things that we want you to test or something like that. So the approach could be done early. But the idea of the certifications, we at OZeWAI, we recognize if people have certifications, but we also understand that there's a lot more to accessibility to actually be involved in the membership. So we don't see it as the specific criteria. There's other criteria that needs to go with it. And I guess to clear the shift left, if you want to bring accessibility earlier, you may not have the coding aspects, that comes with an accessibility audit, but you have the thinking about how to, engage with users the right way. So how do you test that in your certifications? Claire, what do you think? How do you think that valuable certifications are or qualifications?
Yeah, in terms of particularly the certifications, it depends what kind of industry you're aiming in working in. I know a lot of like larger organizations, their hiring people are separate from the role that you're actually going into. So they look for things like uni degrees and certifications, particularly if you're trying to work in government or large corps where your hiring department is often not the team directly that you'll be working with. And a lot of organizations that are trying to bring in skills for accessibility but don't know a lot about accessibility quite often look to things like certifications. So it can be handy for some people if you are trying to break into the accessibility industry and you're not having any luck so far and you see a lot of job ads with certs. It can help get your foot, like Chris, you just said, like get your foot into the first round of interviews, things like that. So for some people it can be handy, but for a lot of us that have been in the industry for a long time don't have certifications because you just build up those skills over a large period of time. I think it also bringing people into the industry that don't have any previous accessibility skills is so valuable as well. People in our team have come from so many different areas and have degrees in so many different random non-IT related things, and it brings in such a more diverse range of experience and skill sets as well when people have different life experiences. And sometimes the certification isn't the be all end all of someone's experience. Like you said, Bree, knowing users and how users get impacted is very important as well. And bringing juniors into the industry is something I'm really passionate about. We hire a lot of juniors at Intopia and bring people in that have never worked in accessibility before and have lots of experience in different industries that aren't specifically accessibility related. And it brings in so much of a fresh perspective and knowledge rather than just a traditional pathway. There is no real traditional pathway for accessibility.
No, there's not exactly right. Look, we're coming up to 1 minute to go, and I'm just going to finish off with just a thank you so much for joining us today. It just flew past, flew past. Such wonderful questions and comments in the chat. Thank you. Thank you so much, Thea, Chris, and Claire. Really appreciate your time. Just to finish up, just a little bit more about, register for OZeWAI events. There's one in August already for small business, not-for-profits, and learning about accessibility. Please share that, because I don't know if necessarily that's within our OZeWAI community as much. So we need to share that one a bit wider to get those tips and tricks out there. And also we've got your colleague, Claire Russ, weekly on the September one of training and courses. Again, really thank everyone for your support for OZeWAI. Please join. We're a growing membership. We're building resources for members as well. We want to build the advocacy for accessibility in the apprenticeship space. We're doing some advocacy with the Future Skills Organisation. There's workshops coming up about that for policy legislative changes. I can say that. There's so much going on. Please support us. We're a not-for-profit, and we love everyone being involved in the community. And we thank everyone for your time. Any final words, Thea, that you'd like to finish off with?
Pretty much just thank you everyone for being here. It is awesome to see so many people interested in accessibility, and I have to thank basically all three of you as well, Claire, Bree, and Chris, because I have learned so much from this talk, because I feel like realistically I'm in the same shoes as a lot of people listening, and it's been so valuable to get all of your insights. So thank you.
Excellent. And for you, Chris, please, would you like to finish off with some final words?
Yeah, thanks for the time and the interesting discussion. I love chatting with different folks about this stuff. Happy to connect with anybody on LinkedIn, and if anybody wants to chat, I'm available to talk nerdy about accessibility, as Claire said.
It's been great having you, Chris. And Claire,
Thank you.
some final words?
Yes, thanks. Same as Chris. I'm happy to connect with anyone on LinkedIn if you have any more questions or want to chat. I think coming back to what we said at the start is always an important reminder. Accessibility is big and overwhelming. If you fix one bug, your website was better than it was before. So keep moving, keep the ball rolling. Don't feel overwhelmed. Start small. There's always that advice.
Excellent. Yeah, and thank you to Kylie in the background there for helping out, and Andrew as well for all the work that you do for OZeWAI. Really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next month.